Olá, amigos do Logos Apologética, tudo bem? Aqui é o Emerson e nesse vídeo de hoje nós vamos fazer um react, né? Assistimos juntos um vídeo que eu legendei aqui, né? Que vocês sabem que eu trago com exclusividade esses vídeos, né? Do inglês e outros legendados ou dublados, narrados, né? Gosto muito disso também. E desde já peço para que vocês apoiem meu canal aí, tá bom, pessoal? Então aqui nós estamos com um vídeo, né, de ciência, certo? Nós vamos falar aqui sobre isso também. Porque é que eu gosto de postar que vocês pedem, certo? Sobre as evidências do teísmo, as evidências da Bíblia, certo? Curiosidades, tudo que vocês tiverem dúvidas, vocês deixam aqui nos comentários, tá bom, pessoal? Então nós estamos aqui, pessoal, com uma entrevista com o Piers Morgan e o cientista, o Meyer, né? Autor de Assinatura na Célula, certo? Ele é um grande defensor do design inteligente. Mas nós estamos aqui falando sobre essa questão que eu achei muito interessante esse vídeo e achei importante compartilhar, mostrar aí. Então, pessoal, vejam só que interessante aqui, certo?
Debate. Is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you get to the first life from the simpler, non-living chemicals? That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest, Richard Dawkins, acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today. But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there in the fossil record, we do see very abrupt, many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life.
So is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. There's the small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power.
You argue there are three big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God? Or God?
Well, right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes. And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What, in fact, the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing. And so the picture of the universe that has emerged starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
Now, my big question for all atheists, well, is, okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case, and that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
Oh, the single cell as opposed to the universe.
Well, I guess you go back to the universe,
Yeah,
and then you go back to the creation of a single cell that has this incredible complexity that eventually, through the process of evolution, leads to human beings.
Yeah, I do think there's...
Do you believe that's really the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell, in the 19th century, Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm.
Brilliant phrase.
Wonderful. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell, we have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing. And that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
But do you believe, like I said, originally there's just one single solitary cell that's created?
Well, right. Presumably that's where...
Is that what you think?
I do think there was an original cell that was created.
Because the theory of evolution says the journey from single cell to the full complexity of life on Earth and so on happened by random trial and error. But your position, I think, is that it's so complicated, this original single cell, so complex for all the reasons you just articulated, that that's just simply not feasible, that it would be just random trial and error. It had to be the creation of some superior entity.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, again, there's two contexts. There's the how do you get to the first cell, and then how do you get from the first cell to everything else. Let's just take the origin of the first cell.
You think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
Right. Here's the evidence, though, that when we see information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, and this is what we actually see in the DNA, when Francis Crick elucidated what he called the sequence hypothesis in the late 1950s, he realized that the 4 subunits along the interior of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of software. What we know from experience is that whenever we say information of that sort, it always comes from a mind. Bill Gates, our local hero, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that it functions like a machine code. Well, what we know is that software comes from a programmer. And in fact, whenever we see information of that kind, whether it's in a software program or a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book, it always arises from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life and even the simplest living cell, I argue, is decisive evidence of the activity of a designing mind in the origin of life.
Certo, pessoal? Então vocês viram aí que interessante, né? O Stephen Meyer, né? Comentando aí, né? Evidências da existência de Deus, né? E também da questão da informação, de onde veio a primeira informação. Então está aí mais um bom vídeo para você mostrar para o seu amigo aí, cético, ateu, para que possa entender, começar a pensar, refletir, certo, pessoal? Porque não é tão simples assim. Nós vemos ali que Richard Dawkins, no seu livro Deus no Delírio, né? Vê que essa caricatura, a crença em Deus é igual a crença em fadas. Os ateístas de YouTube, esses palpiteiros de YouTube, negócio de falar que a Bíblia é um conto de fadas, cópia de mitos, né? Antônio Piranda, né? E outros. Não é bem assim, pessoal. Então nós aqui oferecemos respostas, nós damos respostas. E por isso que se vocês quiserem aprofundar mais, né? Eu recomendo aqui nos sites oficiais, né? Nos links oficiais aqui, na descrição, vocês podem ver aqui, né? Os livros que nós recomendamos. Esses são os links, somente por esses links, pessoal, tá bom? Não vão no Google e outro lugar, não. Somente nos links aqui na descrição, e assim vocês me patrocinam, pessoal, porque eu tenho que parar, pesquisar, fazer vídeos para trazer de conteúdo, tá? E mesmo que o canal aparentemente aqui foi, né, atacado por falsas denúncias, ateístas e tudo mais, nós queremos que o canal cresça, pessoal. Dê um apoio aí, temos outros canais também, peço para vocês se inscrevam, tá? Apoiem meu trabalho, porque para trazer essas informações, pessoal, é muito importante, é muito bom, tá? Então peço para que vocês aí dêem um apoio. Recomendo aqui o box lá do Guarda, do William Craig, olha só, é muito bom, ter um DVD também de estudos e outros, vocês podem estudar mais. E também, principalmente, o combo acadêmico, se vocês querem ter uma formação de um curso livre, tá? Mas vocês podem ter uma formação muito profunda, eu recomendo. E o link está aqui na descrição, tá bom, pessoal? Então é isso aí, um abraço e até mais.